Muy bien, muchas gracias, Debbie. Excelente el panel. Nos vamos a comenzar con nuestro próximo keynote speaker, el señor David Smith. David es Vicepresident America's Head of Occupier Research de Cushman & Wakefield, quien hablará sobre Workplace Ecosystem. David será presentado y acompañado para las preguntas que deseen realizar para el señor Daniel Álvarez, CEO de Cushman & Wakefield en San José de Costa Rica, con cobertura en la región centroamericana. Daniel ha trabajado con clientes en toda Latinoamérica, incluyendo la gestión del portafolio regional de compañías Fortune 100. Más de 15 años de experiencia en bienes inmobiliarios corporativos. Su objetivo principal ha sido trabajar con los clientes en el desarrollo de un profundo entendimiento de sus estrategias comerciales, creando una solución inmobiliaria personalizada para cumplir con sus objetivos de negocios. Recuerden realizar sus preguntas en el chat, se las haremos llegar a ellos para su selección y respuestas. Daniel, bienvenido.
So thank you, Laura, once again on behalf of Cushman & Wakefield for the invitation to one more edition of the Tenant Week. We're super excited of being a crucial part of the event, and especially honored on having David today joining us all the way from Atlanta, Georgia. And David is probably one of the most knowledgeable professionals in the industry in regards of occupiers research. He's our global head of occupier insights for Cushman & Wakefield. David's work is focused on how economics, demographics, technology, and space usage trends impact the future of commercial real estate for occupiers and investors. He produces reports, analysis, and thought leadership that serves clients and internal Cushman & Wakefield service lines, including global occupier services, tenant rep services, co-working, total workplace, consulting, and agency leasing. In addition to advising clients, David frequently participates at industry events and on speaker panels. He has been a presenter at Cornet Global's North American Summit and at main stage speaker at the NHMC annual conference at BOMA and China's annual conference. At Cushman & Wakefield, he leads the development and authorship of industry reports co-branded with Cornet Global. And he has also contributed to or been quoted in various publications, including Globe Street, New York Times, Forbes, NAIOP, Besnow, Commercial Observer, and Cornet Global. So again, David, thank you for joining us today. We're super excited of having you on board, and I know that all of our Latin American participants are really interested in hearing what you have to say and share in terms of the transformation of what we are seeing in the workplace ecosystem. So welcome, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a really kind introduction, and really the honor is mine to be here. I am very excited to be part of this discussion about the future of office. So what I want to do is I want to start with a look back at the history of the office before we go forward with what the future of the office is going to look like, because I think it's really an important part of the story and really informs what we're seeing right now, which is unprecedented in many ways, and what we expect to see as we come out of the pandemic. So if we're on the second slide, where it talks about the historical purpose of the office, we can kind of look at 4 ways in which the office has been utilized historically. And the first way was for management, command, and control. So bringing people and information together really so you could have maximum efficiency and mandate that people got things done the way that you wanted to. And so really the history of the office is not as old as we might think. Sort of the first purpose-built offices were likely in London in the 1700s. You can think of the old Admiralty office, which was for the Navy, the idea to bring all that paperwork and all that information around where the Navy was and where it was moving into one location. From there in New York, we saw accounting houses come up on the eastern side of Manhattan associated with shipping. And again, it was a way to make sure you had all your information together and were able to control that type of information. And then when we get into the 20th century, the Larkin building is a good example of one of the early 1900 buildings built in Buffalo, New York. It was actually built in a way so that management could look down and see all their workers, sort of part of this Taylorism to get their work done, but managing them, maximizing efficiency, being focused on order and rationality. That is no longer, and wasn't pre-pandemic even, the primary or even secondary purpose of the office. If we think about what some of the other historical uses of the office have been, the physical capital needs are a big part of that as well. You know, we didn't have computers in our homes, much less in our pockets 20, 30, 40 years ago. You can even go back 100 years when people coming to the office would have needed a typewriter that they wouldn't have had at home. They wouldn't have had any of that type of machinery or equipment. We can think back to the 1970s and large servers that were putting together area networks and connecting computers, which again only could be done in the office all together. And even more recently, even 20 years ago, in the legal sector, these law libraries that law firms would have prior to being digitized, those were physical spaces that you needed to have space in the office for, and lawyers had to come to or their teams to review that type of information. Again, capital needs it's not that they're non-existent. One of our colleagues that we worked with over at George Washington University on some of this research talked about a family member of his who works in the animation and movies business, and that there is some computing power that is better in the office for some of the work that they're doing, the rendering, than it can be done at home, but it's actually much slower and more painstaking. So there are still some physical capital needs that the office might provide, but for the average office worker, those are fewer and fewer. So the office is not about making sure people get their work done, because the knowledge worker of the 21st century is really able to work anywhere and being trusted to do that. It's not primarily about physical capital needs, because the phones in our pocket have more computing power was on the earth 60 years ago. And we can do emails anywhere. We can do it on the train. You can do it from your couch at home. You don't need an office to come in and do that type of work. But the ways historically that the office has really added value, and which have grown over the last couple of decades and will continue to grow in our minds post-pandemic, are around productivity, innovation, knowledge sharing, creativity. And then the other one is around social and cultural benefits, both to the individual as well as to the organization. And we see this, the first one, the productivity, the innovation, the knowledge sharing, kind of sprout up over the last 20 or 30 years. The Googleplex in Silicon Valley is a great example of this, where people are seen as sources of information and conduits of that information, and that creating environments where people bump into each other, has to talk to each other, connect both around work, but also around play or food or other aspects, actually create better products and services over time. That knowledge sharing, that bouncing around of ideas, that serendipity is of real value in the long term to making better products, to serving customers and clients better. And then finally, the social and cultural one. I think we might still be on the cover page here. If you want to go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. The social and cultural benefits of being in the office. And so to the individual, there's, we are social beings. There's the building relationships. There's building trust with team members. There's being seen by your boss or your boss's boss, and the potential career development that goes along with that. And then the cultural benefits that can accrue to teams and to organizations as a whole, using the office, the physical space, the layout, the campus for large occupiers, to really communicate, this is who we are, this is what we value, this is what we're part of, and that we're part of something bigger than just the project you're working on, or the code you're writing, or the single client you're serving right now. We are a broader organization with bigger goals, and that matters to individuals and to employees to be part of something and to really buy into a culture. So that kind of gives us a sense of what historically has been the purpose of the office. If we go to the next slide, we can start talking about, well, what does remote work do to some key business outcomes. Is it a negative? Is it a positive? Is it a mix on some of these things? And I do want to add a little context here. I referenced briefly George Washington University. We did partner about a year ago with George Washington University and two colleagues over there in particular to do a deep dive on the historical impact of remote work on employees and organizations. We wanted to look at both commercial real estate literature, but also just academic literature on these working experiences, because we wanted to have an outside view and somewhat of an unbiased view of what the benefits are and what the challenges are, recognizing that COVID-19 and this pandemic have changed how both individuals and managers think about remote work and distributed work. So in that research and that partnership with George Washington, we were able to look at productivity, innovation, creativity, company culture, employee engagement, and what data was there pre-pandemic around how remote work and distributed workforces did in these areas. And a couple of things on each of these. So quickly on the productivity side, if you look at surveys coming out over the last year, year and a half now, generally employees have said they are more productive or equally productive than they were pre-pandemic. I think there's a little bit of a caveat there that in the middle of a recession, employees are going to be highly likely to indicate that they are productive. They don't want to communicate something else. But there also is some data around how people are using their time, that if the average commute is roughly 25 to 30 minutes in the morning and the evening, that gives you back almost an hour of time. And some survey work and data collection has shown that about half that time is actually getting spent on additional work. So workers are being more productive in that they are putting in an extra 15 to 30 minutes of time per day. The other half of that commute time that's gone away is being spent on, personal items, things around the home, either chores or fun. So there is some evidence that productivity is a little bit higher when people do work remotely. There is also, a fair amount of research. There was a meta-analysis done in 2007 across 46 different academic studies that showed that there was a limit to this benefit, that the benefit really had when workers were remote up to 2.5 days for the week, and then 2.5 or so days, so 2 to 3 days a week, they were in the office. And then once you got beyond that, you started to see some detrimental impacts of that remote work on the employee experience and then their outputs. When we think about innovation, this is also an area where on one level it's a mixed bag, but it's primarily a negative. And what I mean by that is that there's research that shows that people who do creative type work benefit from getting outside their office from time to time. So that's why ideas pop up to us in the shower. It's a place where we're not really at work, but ideas just kind of flow and we think about things, and it becomes more free flowing. And sometimes we have a spark or an idea. In the same way, getting to a coffee shop or going somewhere that's not your everyday office is a benefit. I will note that working from home is not that exactly, because it's where you live. In some ways, it's not a place to spark serendipity or new ideas in your head, because you have all these ideas around work and then ideas around your home life that are already swirling around. But there are some real benefits to getting some space and away from your teammates and your office. That said, all of that research that was combined with that showed that those workers were also in the office having face-to-face interactions, and that was a critical point. Another study done in Europe showed that employees were much more likely to say they felt less creative working remotely than they were more creative, essentially 3 times as likely to indicate that being remote actually negatively impacted their creativity than to say it was better. In terms of culture, and I'm going to talk a lot about our consulting team and our total workplace consultants and the data they've collected, but that's where we have seen a real detriment. About 50% of all employees right now indicate that they don't feel connected to their company culture, and that's been true throughout the entire pandemic. And that's a real loss that remote work, especially 100% work from home, can have for both the individual who doesn't feel that same connection, that same loyalty, but also for the organization that is losing some of that special sauce of who they are. but also potentially increasing turnover when people don't feel as connected, as loyal, and so they'll walk to the next job a little bit more quickly. And there are real financial costs, obviously, around that. And then finally, on the engagement side, employees have been indicating, obviously, not liking to commute every day. And so remote work gives you some reprieve from that. There's some other areas in which employees have enjoyed, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But ironically, 100% remote work can actually make people feel like they have worse work-life balance. Partially because there's no separation in physical space between where they work and where they live. Obviously, isolation is higher. The feeling of isolation is higher for people who work remotely. And there are a lot of challenges around learning and career development that we'll dive into as well. So if we go to the next slide, this is data collected from or by the Cushman and Wakefield Total Workplace team, where we survey employees of our clients and ask them a series of questions around their experience and how their workspace is, how well they're able to focus, quality of technology, any number of things that you might think about. And we were doing this for several years. This was created in the middle of last decade. We did shift the types of questions we were asking once COVID hit, because it became more of a experience per square foot at home type survey. And now we're really in this hybrid model already, where even though we haven't seen a full return to the office, you have a lot of people still going to the office or returning to the office, plus people working remotely. And so we're able to measure how people are experiencing that and what works well remotely, and how going back to the office regularly also impacts some of their satisfaction and engagement metrics. Some of the things that work really well here on the top, people feel really trusted. That was one of the big things that we learned early in COVID. Was we had this experiment where most office workers, especially if they were not essential to be in the office, were sent home and were asked to work, and managers realized, oh, work is still getting done. And it's an experiment that probably we couldn't have done widely without, unfortunately, this pandemic. And on the flip side, what we've seen is that organizations got really good, especially leading organizations, at talking to their employees, realizing that people were all over the place, they weren't coming into the office, and they had to get real clear about communication, real frequent about that communication, and use different nodes of communication. So employees really do feel informed right now. Some of that is, again, just coming out of a crisis, an organization to manage and lead that well. The other piece of this that comes out over and over again is that employees generally feel like they can focus when they work at home. Now, there are some differences here. If you're a young worker in your early 20s, living in an apartment with 3 roommates, or living in your parents' basement, those people actually don't find it easier to focus. But on the whole, employees do feel like working at home, you can actually focus on your individual work better. And all these things lead to people wanting to see remote work or some sort of hybrid or flexibility increased post-pandemic than compared to what it was in 2019. Now, some of the concerns that we can see on the bottom here. So almost half don't feel like they have a strong sense of well-being. So only 55% do, 45% don't. Less than 2/3 feel like they are learning right now. So about 36% of those people don't. About half of people feel connected to their colleagues, and the other half don't. And as I noted earlier, only about half feel connected to their company culture. And if it's interesting, if we look across some of our Latin American countries, that feeling connected to company culture actually is higher. So in Brazil, it's about 73%. In Argentina, it's 77%. In Mexico, it's over 80%. While here in the United States, it's down around 54%, which is still above the global average, as we see it lower in EMEA in particular, but is well below some of the Latin American responses. That being said, on the well-being side, that's where the U.S. scores are actually higher. They're closer to 50%, whereas several different Latin American countries range from about 40%, saying they have a high well-being, up to 44% having a strong well-being. So these things do vary by geography. It's important, and they vary by role. They vary by personality or persona, and we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things, including sector. And so if we talk about employee overall experience by sector, what we've seen so far is that employees are least satisfied in the non-profit sector, legal sector, financial sector. Tech sector actually is slightly below average, and they get most of the press, whether they're saying, hey, everyone's coming back to the office, or they're saying, hey, you don't have to ever come back to the office. That is the industry that again, makes the most waves in the cultural consciousness. In terms of sectors that are doing better than average, where employees are having higher quality experiences, we see consulting, which was very agile and hybrid pre-pandemic in most cases, the healthcare industry and insurance industry as well, being higher. If we go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about how, we're now 18 months into this in the Americas. The pandemic started to impact us in March of 2020. We're now almost to September, so it hasn't been a stagnant experience, and in fact, we've seen some things that have improved and some things that have dropped over that time. So first, some of the improvements, people feeling like they're doing their best work is up about 7% when we compare the summer of 2020, so about a year ago, to the spring of 2021, just a couple months ago. Challenges at work, or challenges at home but working, has dropped about 5%, but still 60% of employees indicate that they have some sort of challenges working from home. But on the decline side, we can see the connection to company culture, which we already said was a concern, has actually been dropping. It's got an 18% drop. People's ability to learn has dropped about 10%. People's ability to bond with colleagues has dropped about 20%. So some of these things that were struggles at the beginning are actually degrading over time. And one of the colleagues that we worked with over at George Washington likes to talk about this as if it was an endowment fund at a university, as an example, where you put a bunch of money in so that it can grow, but you need to take some of that money out for operations or for the present. But if you start taking out too much money, you start pulling away from your principal. And that's the experience we're in right now. We're really pulling out so much collateral that had been paid in among employees. And so employees that had been working together for 5, 10 years really had a level of trust and connection and ability to work well together that has been drawn down over this time. And it remains to be seen with new employees how connected they get. Their networks tend to be weaker, both internally and within their industry. So there's some real challenges longer term on how this might be experienced. Other things I think worth noting here on the right, this is actually data from Robert Half and Prudential, who does a survey here in the US. But there's, 2/3 of all workers right now indicate that they're working on the weekend. Almost half indicate they're working over 8 hours a day. And this goes back to the point around how coming to the office actually positively impacts people's work-life balance in some instances. Certainly the commute can be really frustrating, and that will vary by city and certainly by individual and where they are. But workers who have reasonable commutes often can feel more of a separation between their work life and their home life that is beneficial for their well-being and their work, because they're able to focus once they get some rest and some separation. You can see on the right here that it's not the same for all employees. So people with kids are working on weekends more, feel like they're working more than 8 hours a day more. And at the same time, younger workers are disproportionately impacted compared to older workers. And both of those things are going to be themes as we go through that, is that working parents have different experiences, and definitely younger workers have more challenges with remote work than our older employees are having right now. If we go to the next slide, some of the things we've been seeing over the last year and a half is obviously that workers have slowly started to come back to the office. Here in the US, we're about 30 to 35% of where we were pre-pandemic in August. It's kind of stalled out as the Delta variant has become an issue. In certain parts of Latin America, we're seeing the percentages probably a little bit lower, maybe 25% of employees back compared to pre-pandemic levels. And obviously, locales will vary based off of growth in COVID and or any variants and local legislation or restrictions. But what we're seeing is when employees do come to the office regularly right now, and we define frequently or regularly about 3 days a week. So if they're coming in at least 3 days a week, there is a premium on their experience and their work right now compared to their colleagues who are coming into the office less than 3 days a week. So that might be never, it could be 1 day or 2 days. And you can see they're pretty distinct and significant differences. People's experience of the culture or connection to the culture, as well as their work-life balance, if they're coming into the office regularly, is higher by about 14%. People's overall experience is up about 12%. Their ability to do their best work is up about 10%, as is their overall employee engagement. And their networks, the ability to connect across their organization, is higher by 8%. So other areas, probably because of the high quality of softwares like Teams and Skype and others that allow Zoom, that allow people to connect with each other, but still a better experience and better outcomes for employees who are coming into the office regularly. And we see some real differences across type of employee. So middle managers actually get the biggest bump from coming to the office on a regular basis. So they're up, their experience and their engagement are up 8% or more, whereas individuals see their experience, so individual contributors see their experience and their engagement improve by about 5 or 6% when they're in the office regularly. And then senior managers actually see the lowest improvement, about 4%. Somewhat interestingly, and maybe ironically, senior managers are the most likely to say they want to get back to the office 5 days a week, 4 days a week, compared to slightly more than middle managers and individual contributors. But as organizations think about their future, they need to be aware that middle managers are in some ways squeezed in the middle, where they are trying to lead people and individual contributors. They're trying to report up the line to senior leadership and executive leadership. And they're going to need help and direction on how often their employees should be in the office, how often they should be in the office, and what the real benefits of that are. And how to kind of sell that to the organization. The other distinction I'll make around employee kind of demographics is tenure seems to matter. So the largest, most common chunk of tenure is the 3 to 5 years with an organization. So you got your honeymooners that first year or two, then you get to year 3 to 5. That's the biggest bulk of employees, and then people who make it past that point and become kind of long-time employees, 5, 10, 15 plus years. What we're seeing is that largest cohort also tends to be the least satisfied. That's true before the pandemic as well as during the pandemic. And they are the group that sees the largest improvement in their experience when they come to the office frequently. So they get the biggest benefit on average of being in the office 3 days a week compared to people who've been with the organization less or who've been with the organization considerably longer than that 3 to 5 year window. Some of the things that we're hearing from employees of our clients on why the office is beneficial for them are all things you've probably heard and even experienced. Feeling like they can socialize, feeling they can collaborate better, having better access to some tools that they might not have, going back to that capital needs, being able to network in person, getting informal training. And this is a big thing for young workers in particular who are not able to get that informal training, that kind of just looking over someone's shoulder, sitting next to someone, asking them kind of semi-random questions about things. That's harder to do over the phone or on a scheduled Zoom call than it is when you just sit in proximity to people who've been in the organization longer and your boss or your boss's boss. And then the last thing is certainly the connection to company culture, which is a big part of that. The reason people like not working in the office some days is, again, as we noted, the commute. Being able to avoid that, not have to do that 5 days a week, having some level of flexibility so you can run out and deal with something at your kid's school or take care of some personal things or things closer to where you live more easily on a day when you're not in the office. That focus talked about earlier, and the ability to have potentially a more casual environment is also a real benefit. So if we go to the next slide, really to sum it up, the future is not binary, meaning we're not moving to a world of 100% remote work, or we're not moving back to a world of 100% or close to it in the office. And in fact, some data here on the left from Gallup was collected prior to the pandemic, and it showed that employee engagement was actually higher in the middle when people were in the office 1, 2, 3, 4 days a week, and remote the other part of the time, they were considerably more satisfied, or their engagement was considerably higher than if they never worked remotely, or if they worked remotely all the time, or even more than 4 days a week. You can see those two on the right there, 32% and 30%. So there is a sweet spot on average for employees. Some employees are going to be happiest being in the office every single day. There's certainly going to be a subset who will never be there or rarely be there, but the bulk of employees are going to want to be there 3, 4 days a week. But one of the things our consulting teams have seen a huge impact is around autonomy, being able to choose when you're in the office, and where you work when you're not is a huge boon for employees. It really drives higher satisfaction, higher overall experience, higher engagement. So the way to maximize the employee experience and the outcomes for a business is to give some level of choice, and also have employees who are in the office pretty frequently. That's where we're seeing the highest scores. On the right, this is more just looking from the company's perspective. This is surveys we did with Cornet Global. And we asked, this is about a year ago, we asked pre-COVID, what was your company's approach to your workplace? Was it primarily office first, hybrid, or remote first? And post-COVID, what are your expectations around that? What's interesting here is not the big gray bar, because we know everyone's thinking about going high. What's interesting is that the remote first didn't change at all. It's 12% pre-COVID, 10% of them saying they're going to be remote first post-COVID. This idea of going 100% remote is going to be more of an outlier than it is going to be the norm. If we go to the next slide, this just real quickly kind of shows how this type of hybrid ecosystem might work, where you might have people working at home. You might have your core urban office where people are coming in a couple days a week, and then you're going to have different types of local community hubs and third places and flex office or co-working. You might have less of your meetings in your actual office and use more of a flexible rent by the hour for some of that stuff around the city. You might locate either satellite offices or utilizing co-working and flex office around the city, so people can have shorter commutes but get out of their home and work alongside some of their peers and their colleagues. If we go to the next slide, this is just, we were looking at a case study of an organization in the Washington, D.C. area to try to understand how does moving to more of a hybrid model impact people's interactions with each other. And I think this was an important finding, which is if there's no management of this, there's no saying, hey, this team's going to get together a couple days a week, or the whole organization is going to be in the office on certain days, that you end up really losing those interactions very quickly. So on the left here, it's just looking at two individuals who work in the same company. If there's no remote work days, they're going to see each other almost 9 out of 10 days. They're each going to have some PTO. They'll get sick. They might travel for work. There's some reasons they won't see each other every single day, but almost every single day they'll run into each other, have a chance to talk. Again, have some serendipitous interactions and so forth. If you move to just one remote day a week, so they're in the office 4 days a week, but one remote day, and you're not managing for that, it's just randomly happening, all of a sudden, about half the time, one of them's in the office and the other is not. And so they're only seeing each other about 55% of the time. That ends up being about 12 days a month, down from the 21, 22 days a month of a work week. And if you move all the way to 3 remote work days a week, Now you're seeing each other less than 3 times a month, 3 days a month. And so the interaction between those two employees drops really quickly. And then on the right, that line chart is actually just showing the same type of concept, but if you're thinking about it across a team. And you can start with a pretty small team, 7 employees. If you want 4 of them, so 50%, just over 50% of them in the office on the same day, but you leave it up to chance. If everyone has a 1-day work, you're already at about 39% of the time they're going to run into each other. If you go up to 2 days a week, less than 1 day a week is half that team going to be in. And of course, the bigger the team, the faster the quote unquote degradation is around that. So a team of 20 employees, even moving to 1 day a week random remote work, less than once every 2 weeks is half that team going to be in the office. So this just points to the idea that this does need to be led. It does need to be managed to some degree, but balancing that with what I said earlier, which is that employees do want some level of choice. They want to be able to have some level of autonomy, and that's going to be a real challenge to balance for organizations. If we go to the next slide, a few final points as we kind of come up on near the end of our time. One is that this really does vary across all kinds of different demographics. So you have varying by department here. You can see certain departments that expect more remote work post-pandemic. Some of those are like finance and legal. Those are also organizations that have not been struggling during this work from home as much as some of the others. Legal, finance, customer service, all alongside IT have done better. There's been some degradation experience, but not nearly as high as some other parts. And that has to do with the type of work a lot of the people in those departments do. A lot of it is more heads down focus work that can be done anywhere. And the creativity, the innovation, the connection isn't as important. Whereas you see a place like sales, which has been struggling more, they have lower expectations moving forward for increased remote work. HR also falls in that category of both having more of a challenge right now and having lower expectations moving forward. So organizations need to think through the type of work individuals are doing and teams are doing. They also need to pay attention to how different types of people will experience this differently. We talked a little bit about younger workers struggling more, and that is true. They have more difficulty working from home, as you can see on the right, and that is true across the globe. There's a number of key reasons for this. Number one is they often don't have the physical space that an older worker has. Number two, they're not as connected, and they don't have the networks, both internally and externally, that their older peers do. And so the ability to kind of learn and connect and do their job actually is degraded more quickly. Third, they want to be seen, and they need more career development at this stage than older workers do. So we go to the next slide. We can actually, I think, jump over this. We sort of touched on this and how it varies by type of work. So I just want to go to the next slide, the bar chart here, to just give a little bit of an overview of our thoughts on what this means moving forward. Two caveats. One, this is North American data. It is not Latin America or the Americas as a whole. And two, that this is actually data we're updating right now. So these numbers are going to change, but directionally they're going to be right, which is our expectation is that agile work and permanent work is definitely going to lead to a reduction in the amount of space needed for a company if their employee base didn't change, the size of their employees change. So that's why you see that light blue and that green yellow color are negative. They're actually pulling down absorption over the next decade. But net, when you think of all the office using jobs that are going to be created over the next decade, there's going to be a lot more demand created for office space than demand taken away because of the increase in agility and permanent work from home. Here in the U.S., we're expected to see office using job growth about 12% over the next 10 years. So that's almost 4 million new jobs. In Brazil, it's going to be about 10%. In Mexico, it's going to be double-digit growth over the next 10 years. So there's going to be significant amounts of new office using workers who need space. And so even at its peak, when agile and work from home is pulling down absorption by 16 million square feet in a given year, we're going to see 4 times as much new absorption needed because of job growth. 99 million square feet being the peak probably right now under our forecast in the middle of this decade. So finally, I know we have about a minute left, and if we have a question or two, that's great. But if we go to the next slide, again, just in summary, I think as organizations are thinking from a perspective of efficiency, so the CFO perspective around how much does this cost, effectiveness from the strategy and the CEO perspective, and then engagement from the CHRO perspective, there's a real reason to believe that a workplace ecosystem that does include core offices, does include more remote work than we had in 2019, is going to be the future, and it's going to include other types of space alongside that in the future. So really appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak, and do welcome any questions if we have any with the 20 seconds or so we have left.
So thank you so much, David. I think we've covered great content. Again, we highly appreciate your participation. We ran out of time, but in case we have any questions from the participants, those can't be responded afterwards, so we can work on that. And again, thank you to the event organization team for all of the support, and we look forward for the next sessions. Thanks again, David.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem.
Muchísimas gracias a ambos, Daniel, David, gracias por habernos acompañado. Nosotros nos vamos a despedir por unos instantes para que puedan atender sus asuntos. Vamos a hacer un break. Les pedimos disculpas por los inconvenientes técnicos. Esperamos que de todas maneras hayan podido disfrutar de la conferencia. Nos volvemos a encontrar a las 14 hora de Costa Rica, 15 hora de México, 17 de Argentina para continuar con nuestra agenda de esta tarde.
Through agility and tenacity, through engineering the exceptional, through negotiating the impossible. It's the energy that defines us, the spirit of entrepreneurship, the will to evolve and adapt, and the power to turn vision into reality. That's Newmark.
Introducing Torre Universal, a modern Class A Plus corporate center located in one of the best commercial areas of the capital. Today, it becomes the most strategic place to generate new business opportunities for our city and country. Torre Universal becomes the best option to create new opportunities and build a better future for the country.